YouTube! Today we're breaking down Claude Fable 5 and Mythos 5 hit with export controls. How US AI regulation could push the world toward China. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Crossover Mind. Now, when you heard the topic, a lot of you probably thought, oh, another AI regulation story. But if you look closely, this isn't just a story about technology. It looks remarkably like that huge shift where manufacturing moved to China over several decades. First, let's carefully lay out what actually happened. According to Axios, U.S. Commerce Secretary Lutnick sent a letter to Anthropic's CEO, Dario Amodei, and the contents were anything but mild. The letter placed the company's newest models, Mythos 5 and Fable 5, under export controls. In other words, they've started treating AI models themselves like missiles or semiconductors. And it's not just exports overseas. This is the most unusual part. Even providing access to foreign nationals inside the United States is now banned. You need a license to use it, and Anthropic was even required to go through individual reviews. The trigger was that another AI company reported to the government that it had successfully jailbroken Mythos. In other words, the safeguards could be broken, and that suddenly raised serious national security concerns. Let me explain just one legal term here, in plain language. There's a concept called deemed export. It means that even within the United States, if you let a foreign national use advanced technology, the law treats it as if you'd exported it to that person's country. And this concept was applied very strictly this time. So what happened? Anthropic concluded that it simply wasn't realistic to precisely single out and block only foreign nationals. And so, remarkably, they had to suspend access to Mythos and Fable for all of their customers worldwide all at once. For ordinary people trying it out for a limited time, and for researchers too, it was as if the tool under their feet had suddenly been yanked away. This measure is part of the same policy stream as the National Security Presidential Memorandum on AI that President Trump signed in June. You could say the US government has now begun to see cutting-edge AI, not as ordinary business software, but as a strategic asset the state must control. Now, here's something worth thinking about. Regulating GPUs, meaning semiconductors, and regulating models are completely different in terms of how manageable they are. An NVIDIA GPU is a physical product you can actually see. Of course, there's smuggling and rerouting, but even so you can track where it ships, how many units, and the transport route. An AI model, on the other hand, is a service in the cloud, and it crosses borders in an invisible form through an API. And here a tricky question comes up. Say you allow a Japanese company to use it, but when you look at that company's employees, contractors, shareholders, and research partners, ties to Chinese nationals or Chinese companies are not rare at all. So who exactly do you permit? And who do you block? And even after you've granted access, how do you confirm that the outputs aren't quietly being used to train another model? This is the genuinely hard part. Once this happens, software loses its core strength, which is the ability to roll out everywhere at once. You need reviews by country, by company, and sometimes even by individual user. Identity checks, contracts, and audits all become heavy burdens. And this may not end with Anthropic alone. There's a real chance the same debate spreads to companies like OpenAI, which offer models with equally powerful cyber capabilities. Now, separately from the regulation, there's another point we need to keep in mind. In fact, even before the regulation arrived, Anthropic was already carrying the seeds of distrust with researchers. Apparently, when questions about developing cutting-edge AI were entered into Fable 5, the company was quietly lowering the quality of its answers without telling users. That drew criticism, and the company apologized. They changed their policy so that going forward, when they switch you to a lower tier model called Opus 4.8, they'll clearly notify the user. But from a researcher's point of view, this just means they now get notified. And this is a really important point for scientists and researchers. What they value above all is being able to reproduce the same experiment under the same conditions. But the model running behind the scenes can quietly swap between yesterday and today, and worse. Even the line where that switch happens isn't disclosed. A service like that is hard to rely on as a foundation for research. Even if you're paying for the most advanced model, depending on the topic, you get routed to a different one. Of course, Anthropic has its reasons too. Beyond national security, there's a business motive, protecting its own edge from distillation, meaning having its excellent models copied by stripping out just the knowledge from them. Fable 5 was also a flagship showcasing the company's technical strength, and it was essential to its brand building ahead of an IPO. But the more they tighten their defenses, the more they end up shutting out the very customers who want to pay to use it. It's quite ironic. Now, let's shift our perspective to the other side of the Pacific. Chinese companies are in a position where they can easily take exactly the opposite strategy from America. DeepSeek, Alibaba's Quint, Moonshot AI's Kimi, Zedai's GLM. These Chinese companies have been offering high-performance models broadly, either through cheap APIs or as open weights. And this open weights part is a big difference. You can download the weights, place them in your own environment, tune them yourself, and use them as a foundation for research. There's no need to wait for anyone's permission. And the price cap is something you really can't ignore either. For example, Xiaomi's open model from China is 43 cents per million tokens for input and 87 cents for output. Fable 5, on the other hand, was $10 for input and $50 for output. That's a price gap of more than 20 times, even if there's still a gap in performance. For research that requires running things over and over, or for low-margin startups. This difference completely changes the decision on which to adopt. On top of that, all across China, there's a growing movement to subsidize the cost for small and mid-sized businesses to rent computing resources. In Shanghai, there have even been reports of a program subsidizing up to 80% of the cost of using AI compute. And underneath all of this is electricity. China is rapidly expanding nuclear power right now, and it has a massive supply network combining coal, renewables, and nuclear. They're even pushing policies that connect cheap inland electricity to data centers. A huge domestic market with price competition, generous support from local governments, and cheap, abundant electricity. All of these combine to create an environment where companies building models can easily offer aggressively low prices. Now, some of you are probably thinking, but China's performance is lower, right? It's true, you can't say they're always equal. But the key point is that this gap is not fixed, according to an analysis cited by MIT Sloan. Open models reach about 90% of the performance of closed models the moment they're released. And the time it takes to close that gap shrank from 27 weeks the previous year to just 13 weeks. That's roughly 3 months. In other words, even if a Chinese model is 4 months or even 6 months, behind the cutting edge, it's plenty good enough for most uses. And put another way, 6 months later it'll be on par with today's most advanced American model. Let me give you an analogy here. A model you can borrow at the world's best performance, but only for a few weeks and only with a license, versus one that's a bit behind but cheap, with stable specs and that you can keep right at your fingertips. Which one becomes the foundation for research and development? You already know the answer. In fact, even American startups have started routing their processing to Chinese models like DeepSeek and to cheap open models, just to avoid those high API fees. They hand only the very hardest jobs to America's cutting-edge models and send the bulk of the rest to cheaper models. And eventually, once they realize the cheaper ones are good enough, they call the expensive models even less often. It's the same in the world of researchers. Papers, evaluation frameworks, fine-tuning code, surrounding tools. Once all of these pile up on the assumption of using Chinese models, this no longer ends as a simple price competition. The developers' very habits, and the whole ecosystem built up around them move over wholesale. This is the deepest rooted part of the whole thing. Now, when you get this far, it lines up perfectly with that manufacturing story I mentioned at the start. American manufacturing moved to China not because Chinese products were all top quality from the very beginning. It was because they could make things cheaply and in huge volumes, improve quickly, and because even the surrounding part suppliers and engineers clustered together in one place. From steel to electronics to smartphone assembly, the industrial base shifted little by little, but surely, and in AI, the same conditions are coming together. American-made models are certainly high performance, but they're expensive, the terms of use are strict, performance gets dialed down depending on your question, and finally you even need permission based on nationality or affiliation to get access. Chinese-made models, on the other hand, may lag a bit in performance for a while, but they're cheap, often open weight, and researchers can handle them freely on their own machines. So in the long run, which one becomes the world standard? And there's a real irony here. The Trump administration has held up bringing manufacturing back to America as a major banner. Yet in AI, regulation meant to protect technology may instead push customers, researchers, and ventures over to the Chinese side. This time, it's not physical factories that move. It's the models themselves, development environments, papers, engineers' experience, and spending on APIs that slip away. You could call it manufacturing relocation, the digital edition. Actually, here's a voice some experts are raising. Back in the 1990s, they tried to stop cryptographic technology at the border by treating it as a weapon, and it ultimately didn't work. This is the same failure, they say. You can't dam up the flow of math and models at a border. And there's another serious issue: talent. In cutting-edge research in Silicon Valley, top researchers and engineers of Chinese origin play a central role. With this measure, those people can no longer even touch the models they themselves built. Companies, fearing regulatory risk, stop putting Chinese nationals on frontier teams from the start, or work visa reviews get even stricter. There's growing concern that this exodus of talented people could, in the end, blunt America's own competitiveness. Of course, I have no intention whatsoever of dismissing the security angle. There's no way you can release truly dangerous capabilities to the whole world with no brakes at all. That's a perfectly legitimate concern. But even if you wall off the most advanced models, the rest of the world isn't going to sit quietly and wait for America's permission in the meantime. Technology that can't be used, no matter how excellent, can never become the standard. That's the hardest dilemma here. This regulation is a measure to protect American AI, but ironically, it could also become a kind of sales pitch that drives developers all over the world toward Chinese models. What took decades in manufacturing might play out in just a few years in the digital world. So from here on, everyone, let's watch not just which AI is the smartest, but which AI is the most widely used, and what kind of ecosystem is growing around it. That's where I'd really love to focus our attention. After all, it's the one who controls the standard that wins in the end. Thank you so much for joining us on Crossover Mind once again today. On Crossover Mind, we bring you the latest on technology, business, and society, and dig deep into the important themes that lie just beyond the headlines. And please don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, take care. See you.